5 in the morning on June 6, 1944. The sky over the Normandy coast was still dark when HMS Warspite's forward 15-inch turrets trained onto the German gun battery at Villerville, northeast of Sword Beach. Her fire control systems had calculated a range of 26,000 yards, nearly 15 miles of English Channel, separating her barrels from the target. The first salvo went out at 0500 hours exactly. Each shell weighed 1,938 pounds. The propellant charges drove them from barrels manufactured for service in 1915, modified during her 1930s modernization to fire at 30 degrees of elevation, on trajectories that would carry them over the horizon before they arrived. The sound of a 15-inch main battery firing isn't a naval gun report in the conventional sense. It's a physical displacement of air, a concussive event that registers miles from the ship and feels, to anyone aboard, less like noise than like pressure. The Villerville Battery had no practical warning of what was inbound. At 26,000 yards, Warspite was below the horizon for anyone standing at ground level on the Normandy coast. The ship doing this was 31 years old. Her keel had been laid at Devonport Royal Dockyard on October 31st, 1912. She had fought at Jutland on May 31st, 1916, survived 2 complete uncontrolled circles in the middle of the German line with her steering jammed, taken 15 heavy-caliber hits, and been under repair at Rosyth for 2 months afterward. She had been bombed off Crete in May 1941, 43 men killed in a single attack, and shipped to an American naval dockyard in Bremerton, Washington, for repairs, because no British facility had the capacity to take her. 8 months before D-Day, a German radio-guided bomb had punched through 6 of her decks and detonated in the double bottom of her hull, blowing a 20-foot hole, flooding approximately 5,000 tons of seawater into her lower spaces and destroying one of her 4 15-inch turrets so thoroughly that the Admiralty chose not to repair it before Normandy. She was firing 6 of her 8 original guns because X turret was dead weight on her quarterdeck. Several officers within the Admiralty had raised the question at various points between 1939 and 1944 of whether she remained worth maintaining. Each time, the answer had been yes. Not because she was modern or fully operational or cheaper to keep than to replace, but because her 15-inch guns remained real, her range remained genuine, and those 2 things together created a problem for any enemy commander who had to plan around where she might be. That problem had been established twice already, in ways that couldn't be forgotten. This isn't a celebration of HMS Warspite. It's an argument about what an obsolete, repeatedly damaged warship can still accomplish, and about what happens to enemy planning once they know exactly what you can reach. Warspite was ordered in 1912 as part of the Queen Elizabeth class, 5 ships that represented a genuine revolution in capital ship design. Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, and Admiral Fisher pushed the design through over significant internal objection on 2 points that would have seemed reckless to a more cautious procurement culture. First, the main battery would be 15-inch guns, a caliber that had never been built, tested, or installed on any warship. The guns didn't exist when the ships were ordered. The turrets were still being designed. The standard process of building a prototype turret, testing it on an existing vessel, and then fitting the class was compressed into almost nothing by the program schedule. Second, the ships would burn oil rather than coal, eliminating the filthy, time-consuming process of coaling ship, and allowing fuel to be pumped aboard in hours. The oil and the new boiler design together pushed intended speed to 24 to 25 knots, faster than any contemporary battleship. She cost £2,524,148 when she commissioned in March 1915. On that day, she represented the leading edge of naval architecture. 30 years is a long time in warship design. The first structural problem was present from launch. The Queen Elizabeth class, as built, displaced more than their specifications had estimated. The ship sat lower in the water than intended. Warspite's 13-inch Krupp-cemented armour belt, designed to sit at the waterline, where it would intercept incoming shells before they reached the hull's vitals, sat partially below the waterline instead. The protection the designers intended was operating in water rather than air, which changed everything about how shells approaching at oblique angles would behave on contact. No reconstruction could remedy this without essentially rebuilding the hull from the keel up. It was present in 1939 and still present in 1944. The second structural problem came from Jutland. On 31st of May 1916, a German shell struck Warspite's port wing engine room. The damage jammed her steering gear while she was executing a turn. Her captain made a decision that wasn't unreasonable given the circumstances. Stopping a 30,000-ton battleship with no directional control in the middle of a capital ship engagement wasn't obviously safer than continuing to move. And he held course while the crew worked on the gear. The result was 2 complete circles under fire, close enough to German guns that she took 15 hits during the uncontrolled manoeuvre. 14 men died. 16 were wounded. The rangefinders and gunnery transmission station were destroyed. Only a turret retained any functionality, operating on local control. The crew corrected the steering after 2 circles. Warspite extricated herself as the Grand Fleet arrived from the north and forced the German High Seas Fleet to retreat south. She reached Rosyth on the morning of June 1st, 1916, and spent 2 months under repair, having fired 259 rounds of 15-inch ammunition over the course of the battle. The steering problem didn't resolve with repairs. The jammed gear at Jutland had introduced irregularities into the helm mechanism that persisted through post-war service, through a partial modernization in 1924, through everything that followed. When the Admiralty undertook the major reconstruction between March 1934 and March 1937, the steering gear vulnerability appeared in the assessment documentation. It wasn't on the list of items to be rebuilt. The budget went elsewhere. What the £2,363,000 reconstruction budget actually bought was substantial, and should be understood precisely. All 24 original Yarrow boilers were removed and replaced with 6 Admiralty 3-drum boilers in new, individually fire compartmentalized boiler rooms. New geared Parsons turbines were fitted in 4 entirely rebuilt engine rooms. Power output increased to 80,000 shaft horsepower. Fuel consumption dropped from 41 tons per hour to 27 at near maximum speed. An operational range improvement of genuine significance for a ship regularly deployed on extended Mediterranean patrols. The 1,500 tons of weight saved by the lighter machinery was reallocated to additional deck armour over magazines and machinery spaces, improving protection against the plunging long-range fire trajectories that Jutland had demonstrated were the real threat to capital ships. The 15-inch gun elevation increased from 20 degrees to 30 degrees, which, combined with the new 6 CR-8 shells, extended maximum range from approximately 23,000 yards to 32,300 yards. The original 14 6-inch casemate guns were removed. 4 twin 4-inch high-angle mountings replaced them for anti-aircraft work. The superstructure was rebuilt entirely. The conning tower, 200 tons of steel now considered tactically obsolete, was removed. 2 aircraft hangars were added for swordfish floatplanes. When Warspite emerged from Portsmouth in 1937 after 3 years of work, she looked like a different ship. Captain Crutchley took command for the recommissioning trials on the Firth of Clyde. The trials immediately identified problems with propulsion machinery and with steering. The official record described the steering difficulty as a legacy of Jutland, which continued to beset Warspite. The most expensive refit of her life, a rebuild costing nearly as much as her original construction, had not fixed the steering. The trials also established her maximum sustainable speed at approximately 23 knots. She had been rated for 24 to 25 knots when built. Nearly £3 million of modernization had produced a net speed reduction of 1 to 2 knots. None of this was concealed from the men who took her to war. Warspite's officers in September 1939 knew exactly what they had: a 27-year-old hull with an armour belt partly below its intended position, steering that could be relied upon only within limits, and a maximum speed that Italian and German capital ships of recent construction could easily exceed. They also had 8 15-inch guns with a maximum range of over 32,000 yards, a gunnery system modernised to current standards, and an admiralty that had invested £4.5 million in the ship across 2 building programmes, and wasn't inclined to retire it without compelling reason. On April 10, 1940, 6 days after German forces secured Narvik and its port facilities, 5 British destroyers under Captain Bernard Warburton Lee attacked the German destroyer force in Ofotfjord. The engagement sank 2 German destroyers and damaged most of the remaining 8, but it also cost Warburton Lee his life and 2 of his ships. When darkness fell on April 10th, 8 German destroyers remained at Narvik, damaged, low on fuel and ammunition, stranded. The tanker assigned to replenish them had been destroyed in the first engagement. The only other fuel source in the harbour was a civilian vessel with improvised pumping equipment, completely inadequate for the task. The German destroyers couldn't leave, couldn't effectively fight, and couldn't easily be supplied. For 3 days, those 8 ships sat in Ofotfjord and its tributary channels, held in place by geography and logistics as much as by British naval power. Generalleutnant Eduard Dietl's mountain troops held Narvik itself, but the German strategic position was deteriorating. The approaches were no longer controlled. The garrison was effectively cut off. British destroyers alone had shown they could take losses going into the fjord. The question was whether anything could clear it without prohibitive cost. What the British had that the Germans couldn't answer was HMS Warspite. Vice Admiral William Whitworth assembled 9 destroyers: Bedouin, Cossack, Punjabi, Eskimo, Kimberley, Hero, Icarus, Forester and Foxhound, and brought them to a rendezvous position at 67 degrees 44 minutes north, 13 degrees 22 minutes east on the morning of the 13th of April. Warspite's captain was Victor Crutchley, the same officer who had taken her through the post-reconstruction trials that had redocumented her steering problems 3 years earlier. Commanding a ship with unreliable helm responses inside Ofotfjord, a channel roughly 35 miles long, flanked by sheer mountainsides that left almost no lateral manoeuvring room, required accepting that limitation as a given. Crutchley accepted it. At 11:52 hours, with the force still approaching from the outer fjord, Warspite catapulted her Swordfish floatplane, aircraft coded C-8B. Sub-Lieutenant Rice was at the controls, with orders for reconnaissance ahead of the fleet, targeting of any suitable objectives, and fire spotting for Warspite's main battery. The Swordfish flew north into Fjord, a tributary channel branching off the main approach. There, on the surface, they found U-64. The submarine was apparently experiencing periscope equipment problems that had prevented diving. She sat on the surface in a position she shouldn't have been in, her crew visible on deck when the Swordfish came over at attack altitude. Rice dropped 2 100-pound anti-submarine bombs. One struck U-64's bow. The submarine heeled immediately as the hull flooded, and her crew went into the water as she sank. It was the first time a Fleet Air Arm aircraft had ever destroyed a submarine. The same aircraft then turned back to the main fjord, scouting German destroyer positions and transmitting targeting data back to Warspite's fire control team. At 12:59 hours, Warspite opened fire with her forward 15-inch turrets. Fjord in April holds snow on the mountains flanking it well into spring, and the water is cold enough that exposure is measured in minutes. What the fjord geometry did to Warspite's main battery fire was acoustically significant in a way that open sea gunnery couldn't replicate. A 15-inch salvo in open water is already the loudest event most people will ever experience close to it. A concussive shock rather than a sound, the muzzle blast displacing air hard enough to be felt hundreds of meters away. Inside a fjord, flanked by granite faces steep enough to throw back echoes from multiple angles, the report of each salvo would have arrived at the German destroyer crews not once, but several times. The original concussion followed by reflections from both walls, the sound fully occupying the air before the shell itself arrived. The German destroyers in Fjord that afternoon had no practical tactical response to the problem Warspite represented. Destroyers aren't designed to fight battleships. They are built for speed, torpedo attacks, and operations against other small surface combatants, not for absorbing 1,938-pound shells from a ship positioned at ranges outside their own armament's effective reach. Closing to torpedo range would have required them to cover miles of fjord under 15-inch fire with nowhere to deviate because the channel walls left no lateral options. The physics were straightforward, and the German commanders could read them. The destroyer Kölner was hit by Warspite's main battery early in the engagement. The 15-inch shells tore through her relatively thin, unarmoured plating without detonating on initial contact. They were designed for armoured targets and passed through, each impact rocking the vessel visibly as the round exited the far side. Kölner was then finished with a torpedo by one of the British destroyers. The Erich Gieser sortied to fight and was overwhelmed by fire from multiple directions. The remaining German destroyers made for the tributary inlets at the fjord's eastern end: Georg Thiele, Bernd von Arnim, Wolfgang Zenker, and the others, seeking shelter in channels narrower than Warspite could follow, but finding no exit route on the other side. A Norwegian mountain battery on the fjord's southern shore opened fire on Warspite during the battle. They had a light howitzer, and they used it, getting rounds away at a 36,000-ton battleship from close enough to be courageous and far enough from effective range to be unable to cause damage. Warspite's secondary armament silenced the battery. The British accounts noted the Norwegian effort without condescension. At 15:30 hours, Warspite recovered her Swordfish. At 1755, the force began retiring from the fjord. British destroyers remained to deal with the German vessels in the tributary inlets. Whitworth's report confirmed all 8 German destroyers at Narvik had been accounted for. Some sunk in the engagement, some scuttled by their crews once their situation became clear. Combined with the 2 destroyers lost on April 10th, all 10 German destroyers that had entered Norwegian waters to deliver Dietl's mountain troops were gone. By mid-1940, the Kriegsmarine was working with dramatically reduced surface capability. The Norway campaign as a whole had cost it several cruisers. The Second Battle of Narvik had costed half the destroyer strength available for North Sea and Norwegian operations. The German surface fleet that would operate for the remaining 5 years of the war was the one that survived the Norwegian campaign. And within the losses of that campaign, Ofotfjord on the 13th of April accounted for a substantial portion of the subtraction. Churchill wrote that Warspite's guns in the fjord sounded like the voice of doom. Whatever one thinks of Churchill's prose, the physics were correct. A 15-inch salvo in a mountain fjord is the voice of a weapon class the enemy has no effective answer to. 3 months later, Warspite was in the Mediterranean as the flagship of Admiral Andrew Cunningham's fleet. Cunningham had flown his flag from her at Alexandria since May 1940, having transferred the Mediterranean Fleet's command to his fastest available ship. On July 7, 1940, he led his force out of Alexandria to cover a convoy running between Malta and Alexandria, knowing Italian reconnaissance was tracking him and that the Regia Marina was at sea simultaneously. Admiral Inigo Campioni commanded the Italian force. 2 battleships, the Giulio Cesare and the Conte di Cavour, both extensively rebuilt in the 1930s and capable of 27 to 28 knots. 6 heavy cruisers, 8 light cruisers, and 16 destroyers. Cunningham had 3 battleships, the elderly carrier Eagle, 5 cruisers, and 16 destroyers. The numbers suggested a fleet action on approximately equal terms. The actual engagement was shaped by a capability gap the numbers concealed. Campioni's standing orders from Supermarina were explicit. Protect the convoy bound for Libya. Avoid engagement unless Italian forces were clearly superior. Those orders reflected a considered Italian strategic position. The Regia Marina had genuine strengths. Its torpedo boats, its submarines, its frogmen would all prove formidable. But fleet engagement against British heavy units in the open sea wasn't where Italian naval doctrine said advantage lay. Campioni was operating within a framework designed to preserve his force, not expend it. As the 2 fleets converged on the afternoon of July 9, 1940, the problem with that framework became visible. The Italian heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns outranged the British light cruisers carrying 6-inch weapons. The British screening force was being pressed back toward Cunningham's main body. Of Cunningham's 3 battleships, the Malaya and the Royal Sovereign, neither modernized, neither capable of matching the pace at which the engagement was developing, were falling behind. Only Warspite was in position to make a difference. Cunningham ordered her forward. The 2 Italian battleships advanced to meet her. What followed was an artillery duel at distances that pushed both sides' equipment toward its operational limits. Giulio Cesare, herself reconstructed in the early 1930s and capable of 27 to 28 knots, opened fire on Warspite at 1552 from a range of 26,400 meters. Both ships were trading salvos in near maximum range conditions, the shells taking nearly a minute to complete their trajectories. The fall of shot arriving well after the guns that fired it had already reloaded and trained again. At 15:59, one of Warspite's 15-inch shells struck the Giulio Cesare. The shell hit the rear funnel of the Italian battleship and detonated in the structure immediately above the boiler rooms. The blast drove combustion gases and dense smoke directly downward into the engine spaces. Men in the boiler rooms abandoned their stations as the air became unbreathable. 4 of Giulio Cesare's 8 boilers shut down in rapid succession. Within minutes, her speed fell from 27 knots to 18 knots, a reduction of more than 30% in less than the time it took Warspite to reload and fire again. The ship's electrical systems briefly failed, causing a temporary loss of power across multiple systems, including forward fire control. Steering had to be transferred to emergency arrangements. The crew, working to restore the ship's systems, was doing so in a vessel that had just received a hit at a range most naval analysts of the period would have considered improbable. The range, confirmed by both the 1957 British Naval Staff history and by Italian sources, approximately 24,000 metres. That translates to 26,200 yards, just under 15 miles. This figure appears frequently in naval history as the longest range hit on a moving target in history. The record is genuinely shared. On June 8, 1940, 5 weeks before Calabria, the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst struck the British carrier Glorious at approximately 26,400 to 26,465 yards during the Norwegian campaign. The naval analyst Tony de Julian, who examined both engagements against German after-action reports and the Warship International account of the Glorious sinking, concluded the distances were essentially equal within the rangefinder accuracy of the period. Both hits were exceptional. Warspite didn't hold the record alone. What the hit on Giulio Cesare did to Italian operational planning is a different and more consequential matter. At 16:01, 2 minutes after the hit, Campioni ordered a change of course. Italian destroyers began generating smoke screens. The battleships moved behind the cover toward Messina. The entire Italian fleet had withdrawn to port by early evening. How to interpret that withdrawal has been contested since the day it happened. Campioni's post-action report described a coordinated tactical maneuver designed to allow his destroyers to execute torpedo attacks under the cover of the smoke. A textbook response to an unfavourable gunnery exchange, not a panicked retreat. Cummingham, reading the same engagement from Warspite's bridge, called it a retreat. Both characterizations are defensible. Campioni was operating within orders that told him to avoid engagement unless conditions were clearly superior. After 15:59, they clearly weren't. His decision to withdraw 2 minutes after the hit was consistent with his standing orders and with the tactical situation his flag captain was reporting. What isn't contested is the physical result. Giulio Cesare's speed cut by nearly a third, her fire control destroyed, her crew fighting to restore basic systems, and the Italian fleet no longer willing to test British gunnery at the ranges the afternoon had established as viable. Casualty figures for Giulio Cesare from the hit are disputed. British and Italian records diverge significantly, and neither can be verified against the other from available primary sources. The physical damage is confirmed regardless, and those facts are sufficient to explain everything that followed. In his dispatch to the Admiralty afterward, Cunningham wrote of the hit on Giulio Cesare that it might perhaps be described as a lucky one, but that its tactical effect was to induce the enemy to turn away and break off the action, and that strategically it probably had an important effect on Italian mentality. Cunningham wasn't given to wishful assessments. He had watched the Regia Marina for months, had little respect for what he considered excessive Italian caution, and was writing a formal dispatch to the Admiralty rather than a private letter. Those words were a precise professional judgment, not an insult. Italian naval sources examining the period note that Supermarina's doctrine after Calabria explicitly incorporated awareness of British heavy gun reach, specifically the demonstrated fact that a single 15-inch shell from an elderly British battleship had crippled a modern Italian capital ship from 15 miles away. Every Italian fleet sortie that followed Calabria had to answer the question of where Warspite was and what she could reach. British analysts at the time identified her explicitly as the only capital ship in the Mediterranean fleet capable of engaging Italian forces at the ranges the Battle of July 9th had established. The other British battleships at Calabria had never come into effective gunnery range. Warspite had. That distinction was operationally decisive. No Italian or German planning document naming Warspite specifically as the reason for avoiding a particular engagement has been located in accessible archives. What the record shows is behaviour. A Regia Marina that became demonstrably more cautious about fleet action after July 1940, more insistent on air superiority and favourable conditions before committing capital ships, less willing to test British gunnery at extended range. Cunningham spent the next 2.5 years attempting to force the Italian battle fleet into a second fleet engagement on the terms Calabria had established. He largely failed. The Italians had learned from the first one. After Calabria, Warspite spent the second half of 1940 and the early months of 1941 doing what Cunningham needed most from her: being present. Convoy escort, shore bombardment, fleet sweeps that forced Italian commanders to factor in her known location before committing their own forces. She stayed close to the carrier Illustrious when Stuka dive bombers nearly sank her in January 1941, providing anti-aircraft cover as the damaged carrier limped into Valletta. A bomb hit Warspite during that engagement at a glancing angle and ricocheted off an anchor without detonating. A near miss. Then came the Battle of Cape Matapan on 28th March 1941, where Warspite, Valiant and Barham caught 3 Italian heavy cruisers, Pola, Zara and Fiume, at night, and destroyed them at close range. 5 of Warspite's first 6 shells against the cruiser Fiume found their target. Then came Crete. On the 22nd of May 1941, during the evacuation of British and Commonwealth troops from Crete under sustained Luftwaffe attack, Warspite took a direct bomb hit in the crowded waters south of the island. 43 men died. The blast damaged propulsion spaces and put equipment out of action throughout the ship. The scale of the damage meant no British dockyard in the theatre had the capacity to repair her quickly, and speed of repair mattered. Cunningham couldn't hold the Mediterranean Fleet's flagship out of action for months while she waited for a British slip to open. She went to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. An American naval dockyard working on a British battleship in October 1941, 6 weeks before Pearl Harbor. The photograph from that period shows her alongside American industrial infrastructure that would be at war itself before she left. She completed repairs, crossed the Pacific to join the Eastern Fleet in early 1942, and by the summer of 1943 was back in the Mediterranean, preparing for the Italian campaign. On September 2, 1943, Warspite and the battleship Valiant bombarded Reggio Calabria as the Allies prepared to cross to the Italian mainland. 7 days later, the landings at Salerno began. On the 16th of September 1943, the 7th day of the Salerno operation, German Dornier Do-217 aircraft arrived over the beachhead carrying FX-1400 guided bombs. The Fritz X was a weapon that deserves specific description because it wasn't a conventional bomb. It weighed approximately 3,000 pounds. A radio transmitter in the releasing aircraft kept it in communication with a controller who tracked the weapon visually through a flare burning in its tail and adjusted its trajectory via radio signals to movable tail fins. It was, in all functional terms, a precision-guided munition, one of the first used in combat anywhere. On September 9th, a Fritz X from the same weapon series had struck the Italian battleship Roma as she steamed toward Allied ports after the Italian armistice. Roma sank in approximately 20 minutes, taking more than 1,300 men with her. The weapon worked exactly as designed. On September 16th, at least one Fritz X struck Warspite. The weapon's nose pierced the deck and drove through 6 successive decks before the fusing system activated and it detonated in the double bottom of the ship, the structural keel region at the very base of the hull. The explosion tore a 20-foot hole through the bottom plating. The sea pressure at that depth drove water into the breach immediately and massively. Approximately 5,000 tons flooded in. The ship developed a steep list within minutes as the water redistributed through her lower compartments. 4 of her 5 boiler rooms flooded out. All steam pressure was lost. Without steam, the pumps that might otherwise have managed the flooding couldn't operate. Without pumps, the flooding continued on its own terms. 9 men were killed, 14 were wounded. X turret, the third of Warspite's 4 main battery turrets, positioned aft of the second funnel, had its mechanisms destroyed by shock damage transmitted through the hull from the detonation. The assessment afterward was unambiguous. Restoring X turret to operational condition would require rebuilding the hull structure around it. That was a task requiring dry dock facilities and months of work that would produce, at the end of it, 2 additional 15-inch guns on a ship that already had 6 operational and was 30 years old. American tugs responded first, towing Warspite to Malta for emergency stabilization. From Malta, she was moved to Gibraltar. From Gibraltar, she sailed to Rosyth for the permanent repair work, which took approximately 7 months. Sea trials on the Firth of Clyde followed in May 1944. The Admiralty's internal discussion about whether to repair her at all was real. The question of whether the tactical value of returning her to service justified the cost of the reconstruction was explicitly raised. The answer required calculating what she could do in the operational situation that actually existed in 1944, which was shore bombardment during the planned Normandy landings, for which heavy guns and long range were the decisive variables. Speed wasn't required. Full armament wasn't required. A hull younger than 30 years wasn't required. 6 15-inch barrels at 26,000 yards were required. And Warspite had those. She returned to service with X turret inoperable, propulsion partially restored, and a hull that the Admiralty had decided was good enough for what they needed done. The operational assignment for Operation Neptune was straightforward. Warspite was placed in the Eastern Task Force's bombardment squadron, charged with suppressing German coastal batteries before the landings began and providing fire support to ground forces afterward. Shore bombardment was a mission for which her limitations, the missing turret, the repaired but imperfect propulsion, the 31-year-old hull, were essentially irrelevant. The target was fixed, the range was known. The guns needed to reach it and fire accurately, which 6 of her 8 could do. At 0500 hours on June 6, 1944, Warspite began the bombardment of Villerville Battery from 26,000 yards and worked through her assigned targets as the landing craft moved toward the beaches. In the days that followed, she engaged the Le Havre Battery from the Normandy gun line, providing heavy fire support to British ground forces advancing inland. That autumn, she participated in the bombardment of Walcheren Island during the Allied campaign to clear the Scheldt estuary. A 15-inch shell arriving from 15 miles carries the same energy regardless of the age of the hull that fired it. The German installations at Villerville didn't know and wouldn't have cared that X turret was inoperable. 6 operational barrels producing heavy naval gunfire support was sufficient for what the Admiralty had assigned her to do. She was decommissioned at Portsmouth on February 1, 1945. She had been in continuous service since March 1915. Nearly 30 years, through 2 world wars, under every operational condition the Royal Navy encountered in that span. Her battle honours, when counted: Jutland, 1916, Atlantic, 1939, Narvik, 1940, Norway, 1940, Calabria, 1940, Mediterranean, 1940 to 43, Matapan, 1941, Crete, 1941, Malta convoys, 1941, Sicily, 1943, Salerno, 1943, Normandy, 1944, Walcheren, 1944, Biscay, 1944, English Channel, 1944, plus earlier honours stretching back to Cadiz in 1596 and Quiberon Bay in 1759. The most battle honours ever awarded to an individual ship in the history of the Royal Navy. That record hasn't been broken. The core strategic argument in the title of this video requires an honest accounting of what the evidence actually supports. No Kriegsmarine War diary entry naming Warspite specifically as the reason for avoiding a Norwegian operation has been located in the accessible record. No Supermariner planning document with a date stamp has been found explicitly recording a sortie cancelled because of Warspite's reported position. The thesis that Axis commanders had to plan around her is built from fleet behaviour, not from written Axis doctrine. And that distinction is worth stating clearly, because the audience deserves to know what kind of evidence they are looking at. Fleet behaviour, measured across months and years of consistent pattern, isn't a weak argument. It's frequently a more reliable indicator of what commanders actually believed than their stated justifications, which were subject to the same institutional pressures that affected all official correspondence. What Italian fleet commanders did after Calabria, what their sortie patterns looked like, how their willingness to engage British heavy units changed, is directly measurable from the operational record. Before July 9, 1940, the Regia Marina sortied regularly and showed willingness to bring capital ships into proximity with British forces. After Calabria, the Italian battle fleet became measurably more restrictive about the conditions under which fleet engagement was acceptable. Italian battleships became specifically reluctant to operate at the ranges the afternoon of July 9th had now demonstrated were viable for British 15-inch gunnery. Supermariners' standing orders, avoid engagement unless forces are clearly superior, predated Calabria. But the specific demonstration of what 15 miles meant in practice gave those orders operational weight they had not previously possessed. Before Calabria, the order was a policy. After Calabria, it was a policy with a data point behind it. That Warspite was specifically the cause, rather than British naval presence generally, is supported by the contemporary British assessment that identified her explicitly as the only capital ship in the Mediterranean fleet capable of engaging Italian forces at extended range. The Malaya and Royal Sovereign had both been present at Calabria. Neither came into effective gunnery range during the battle. The distinction between what those ships could reach and what Warspite could reach was operationally known on both sides after July 9, 1940. Italian fleet commanders planning a sortie had to answer a question that had no comfortable resolution. If Warspite was at sea and in the theatre, there was no safe engagement distance at which Italian capital ships could fight on their own terms. At Narvik, the scale shift was even simpler. Destroyers can't fight battleships in confined waters. The German commanders at Narvik had no practical tactical response to Warspite's presence in Ofot Fjord, except to seek shelter in tributary inlets, and the tributary inlets offered no exit. The elimination of all 10 German destroyers in both Narvik engagements was the largest single reduction in Kriegsmarine surface capability during the Norway campaign, and Warspite's guns were the decisive element of the second engagement. She was never modern. She was never fully repaired, not after Crete, not after Salerno. By Normandy, she was operating with one turret permanently silent, and a hull that the Admiralty had concluded wasn't worth the reconstruction cost to fully restore. Britain continued deploying her not because they believed she was equivalent to a new ship, but because the weapon she carried, 8 15-inch guns, now 6, with a range that had been extended by the 1937 reconstruction to over 32,000 yards, continued to provide something that no other available hull could replicate as cheaply or as immediately. Enemies who had experienced what she could reach didn't need to know whether her hull was old, or her turrets were operational, or her steering was reliable. They needed to know where she was. In 1946, the Admiralty sold Warspite to Metal Industries for scrapping at Faslane. The price was £101,275. Proposals to preserve her as a museum ship had been considered and concluded impractical. The cost and logistics of maintaining a 36,000-ton battleship as a static exhibit weren't supportable in post-war Britain, where rationing was still in force and the naval budget was contracting sharply. She was prepared for the tow north and departed Spithead in April 1947. On 23rd of April 1947, the tow parted in heavy weather in Mounts Bay off the Cornish coast. The ship that had been struck by 15 shells at Jutland, bombed twice in the Mediterranean, hit by one of the world's first precision-guided weapons off Salerno, and used as a shore bombardment platform at Normandy, with one turret destroyed and another month's worth of sea trials behind her. That ship now drifted on the tide in Mounts Bay until she grounded on the rocks at Prussia Cove, Cornwall, and stayed there. Attempts to refloat her failed. A 36,000-ton hull settled into Cornish rock does not come off easily, and Warspite had had decades of practice at not going where she was directed. Partial scrapping began on site. It continued for 9 years. The last 600 tons of her hull were finally blown up when conventional cutting and removal proved insufficient. She wasn't entirely gone until 1956. A memorial stands near Prussia Cove today. The grounding was the result of a tow line parting in bad weather. These things happen. But the operational record that led to that moment, the German destroyers in Orfot Fjord on the 13th of April 1940, the Giulio Cesare losing half her boilers on the 9th of July 1940, the Villerville Battery receiving 15-inch fire at 0500 on June 6, 1944, establishes a coherent pattern that ran from the first weeks of the war to the last months of it. Britain kept treating her as nearly finished. She kept being operationally relevant. That isn't sentiment. It's a description of what a surviving concentration of heavy guns, extended range, and institutional competence can accomplish regardless of the hull age surrounding it. The enemy commanders who had to plan around her understood that, even if the Admiralty sometimes seemed uncertain. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe.